September arrived with cooler temperatures and the beginning of the harvest's most intensive phase. The tobacco leaves had reached peak maturity, their color shifting from green to golden yellow, and every enslaved person on the plantation worked from dawn to dusk, cutting, hanging, and curing the crop that represented Whitmore's entire fortune. Sarah's hands were perpetually raw, her back ached constantly, and exhaustion had become her natural state. But physical suffering paled compared to the psychological terror that intensified as the season progressed. While the rest of the plantation focused on the harvest, something darker was unfolding. Sarah noticed Hutchins paying particular attention to the younger women, walking through the quarters at odd hours, making comments about who looked healthy and well-formed. Several of the men had been sold or traded to other plantations in recent weeks, and older Benny explained the strategy with bitter clarity. He's removing the men they don't want breeding, keeping only the strongest, tallest, healthiest specimens. They're planning to increase the population deliberately, and they don't want any complications, no husbands who might cause trouble, no fathers who might try to protect their daughters. The week after the full moon in September, Hutchins assembled all the women and girls over the age of 12 in the yard outside the main house. Whitmore stood on the porch, his expression businesslike as he surveyed his human property. Eleanor watched from an upstairs window, her face a pale oval behind the glass. "I'll be direct," Whitmore announced, his voice carrying across the assembled group. "This plantation requires growth to remain competitive. Each of you women represents not just labor, but potential increase. I expect cooperation in this matter. Those who prove productive will find their circumstances improved. Those who resist will discover that I have methods of ensuring compliance." Sarah felt cold despite the warm afternoon sun. Around her, women shifted nervously, some openly weeping, others stone-faced with resignation. Little Grace pressed against her older sister Mercy's side, not understanding but sensing the danger. Abini stood tall and defiant, though Sarah noticed her hands trembling slightly. That night, the selection began. Hutchins entered the women's quarters after dark, carrying a lantern, and called out 3 names: Rachel, Hannah, Sarah. Sarah's heart hammered as she stood, her legs barely supporting her weight. Rachel, a woman of 20 who'd given birth to 1 child already, moved with the mechanical compliance of someone who'd learned resistance was futile. Hannah, only 14, sobbed quietly as she walked toward the door. They were marched across the yard to Hutchins' cabin, a small structure near the main barn that glowed with candlelight from within. Inside, the space was sparse but cleaner than the slave quarters. A bed, a table, some chairs, and a chest. Hutchins closed the door behind them and turned to face the 3 women. His expression held no warmth, no humanity, only the cold calculation of a man performing a task he considered necessary. "Strip down to your shifts," he ordered. "I need to examine each of you, determine your suitability for breeding purposes. The masters invested good money in you, and we need to ensure you're capable of producing healthy offspring." Rachel complied immediately, her movements practiced, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the cabin walls. Hannah froze, and Sarah felt her own body rebel against the command, every instinct screaming to run, to fight, to do anything but submit. But where could they run? The penalty for attempted escape was whipping, sometimes worse, and fighting would only bring more violence down upon them. Hutchins stepped toward Hannah, his patience clearly limited. "Did you hear me, girl, or do you need encouragement?" Before he could reach her, Sarah heard herself speak, surprised by her own voice. "Please, sir, she's frightened. Give her a moment." Hutchins turned to Sarah, his expression dangerous. "You volunteering to go first, then? Eager to serve?" Sarah wasn't eager for anything except survival, but she recognized a tactical opportunity. If she could buy Hannah even a few moments of mercy, perhaps. She nodded slowly, and Hutchins smirked. "Smart girl. Master said you had spirit. Let's see if that spirit translates to fertility." What followed was humiliating beyond measure. Hutchins examined each woman with clinical detachment, asking crude questions about their monthly courses, whether they'd borne children, commenting on their physical attributes as if they were livestock at auction. He took notes in a ledger, recording his observations for Whitmore's review. When he finished with Sarah, she was shaking so hard her teeth chattered, but she'd maintained her composure, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Rachel was dismissed back to the quarters first, then Hannah, who fled sobbing into the night. Sarah waited for her own dismissal, but Hutchins gestured toward the bed instead. "Master wants to see you personally. You're to wait here until he arrives. Clean yourself up, make yourself presentable." Cold dread washed over Sarah. She'd heard the whispers about women summoned to the main house, about what happened in Whitmore's private study. She'd seen the hollow eyes of those who returned, and now it was her turn. Hutchins left, locking the door behind him. Sarah stood alone in the cabin, her mind racing through impossible options. She could refuse and face whipping, branding, or worse. She could try to escape through the window and be caught, returned, made an example. Or she could endure, survive, live to see another day, and perhaps eventually find a way to resist from within the system that trapped her. She thought of her mother, of the stories she'd told about their ancestors, warriors and healers, people who'd survived droughts and wars and the passage of empires. "We bend, but we don't break," her mother had said. "We survive, so that one day our children or our children's children might live free." The door opened perhaps an hour later. Thomas Whitmore entered, closing it quietly behind him. He looked different outside the formality of the plantation house, less the distinguished gentleman, more predatory. He studied Sarah with those cold eyes, then spoke in a tone that attempted gentleness, but held an underlying threat. "Sarah, isn't it? You've been here 6 months now. Hutchins tells me you're intelligent, capable, and healthy. I have plans for you." Sarah kept her eyes lowered, her voice steady though her heart raced. "Yes, master." "Good. I appreciate obedience. Makes things easier for everyone." He moved closer, and Sarah could smell tobacco smoke and wine on his breath. "You understand the situation here, don't you? The reality of your position?" "Yes, master." "Then you understand that resistance is pointless. But cooperation can lead to better treatment, a lighter workload, better food, a room in the house perhaps, away from the quarters." His hand reached out, touching her chin, forcing her to look up at him. "I can make your life here bearable, Sarah, or I can make it hell. The choice is yours." It wasn't a choice at all, and they both knew it. But Sarah understood the game being played. He wanted her to feel complicit, to believe she had agency in what was about to happen. It was a psychological manipulation designed to ease his conscience and break her spirit. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted outside, shouting, the sound of something crashing. Whitmore's expression darkened with annoyance. He released Sarah and moved to the door, opening it to reveal chaos in the yard. Fire blazed from the tobacco-curing barn, flames reaching toward the sky, and enslaved people were running with buckets toward the well. "Damn it!" Whitmore rushed out, joining the emergency response, and in the confusion, Sarah found herself forgotten. She slipped from the cabin and ran toward the women's quarters, her heart pounding, not daring to believe this reprieve, this momentary salvation. Inside the quarters, she found Abini and several other women waiting, their faces grim but determined. Abini pulled Sarah close and whispered, "Marcus set that fire. Bought you time, child. But it won't last. You need to understand what you're facing, and you need to decide how you're going to survive it." The fire was extinguished before it could spread beyond the single barn, but the damage was significant. Hundreds of pounds of tobacco destroyed, representing a substantial financial loss for Whitmore. Marcus was nowhere to be found, and by dawn it was clear he'd used the chaos to attempt escape. Dogs were brought in to track him, and by noon the next day he was captured 5 miles from the plantation, dragged back in chains. The punishment was public and brutal. All enslaved people were assembled in the yard to watch as Marcus was tied to the whipping post. Whitmore himself delivered the sentence: 50 lashes for destruction of property, 50 more for attempted escape. Sarah watched with tears streaming down her face as the whip fell again and again, as Marcus's back became a mass of bloodied flesh, as his screams echoed across the plantation. The message was clear: this is what defiance costs. But even as Marcus was cut down and carried away to recover or die, Sarah saw something in the eyes of those who'd watched. Not submission, not surrender, but a burning anger that no amount of violence could fully extinguish. Marcus had tried to save her, had sacrificed himself for one small act of resistance. His attempt had failed, but the intention mattered. It planted a seed in Sarah's mind, a dangerous, necessary seed that would grow in the coming months. That evening, as Sarah tended to Marcus's wounds under Abini's supervision, he whispered through cracked lips, "Don't let them break you. Don't let them make you think this is all there is." Sarah squeezed his hand gently, understanding that resistance took many forms. Sometimes it was fire and flight. Sometimes it was simply refusing to let them destroy your soul, even as they controlled your body. She would need to find her own form of resistance, her own way to survive with her humanity intact, because this was only the beginning of a long struggle, and she needed to be strategic, patient, and above all, enduring. If you're finding yourself drawn into Sarah's story and the dark reality she faces, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more hidden histories from America's past that many would prefer remained buried. Winter descended upon Virginia with unusual harshness that year of 1642, bringing freezing temperatures that penetrated the gaps in the quarter's walls and turned the morning water buckets to solid ice. The tobacco harvest was complete, the damaged barn rebuilt, and Marcus had survived his punishment, though his back would bear the scars forever. The plantation's rhythm shifted to winter tasks, repairing fences, processing last season's crop, preparing fields for spring planting. But for the women, a different kind of work intensified. Whitmore had become obsessed with his breeding program. The loss of tobacco in the fire had made him more determined to recoup his investment through natural increase of his enslaved population. A new ledger appeared, kept by Eleanor under her husband's instruction, documenting each woman's monthly courses, any pregnancies, the health of existing children. The invasion of privacy was total and dehumanizing, reducing complex human beings to breeding stock whose value was measured solely in reproductive capacity. Sarah had managed to avoid Whitmore's direct attention since the night of the fire, but she knew it was temporary. Hutchins continued his regular examinations, and several women had already been deliberately paired with men selected for their physical strength or size. Mary, a quiet woman of 19, had been forcibly married to Big John, a field worker standing 6.5 feet tall. The ceremony was perfunctory. No celebration, no joy, just Whitmore reading a brief passage and declaring them husband and wife before sending them to a separate cabin with explicit instructions about their duties. Sarah spent increasing time with Abeni, learning the older woman's accumulated wisdom about survival in this brutal system. Abeni had been enslaved for 43 years, had borne 8 children, and had seen unspeakable horrors, yet she maintained a core of steel that intimidation couldn't break. She taught Sarah about medicinal plants that grew in the woods beyond the fields, about herbs that could ease pain or induce miscarriage if a woman chose that desperate path. She taught her about the network of communication between plantations, the whispered news that traveled through clandestine meetings and coded songs. And she taught her about resistance, not the dramatic, doomed rebellion that would only bring death, but the quiet, persistent resistance that preserved dignity and occasionally created opportunities for something more. They think we're animals, Abeni said one evening as they sorted dried herbs in the corner of the quarters. They think we don't love our children, don't mourn our dead, don't feel pain the way they do. That ignorance is both a curse and a weapon. Let them think we're stupid, docile, accepting. Meanwhile, we remember everything. We plan. We wait for our moment. Sarah absorbed these lessons with desperate attention. She learned which overseers could be manipulated with apparent cooperation, which were genuinely dangerous and unpredictable. She learned the rhythms of the plantation when attention was focused elsewhere, when small acts of resistance might go unnoticed. She learned codes, songs that warned of danger, ways of arranging items that conveyed messages, the complex language of survival that enslaved people had developed over decades. In January, the first pregnancy was confirmed. Mary, married to Big John just 2 months earlier, missed her courses twice and began showing signs of morning sickness. Whitmore was pleased, increasing her rations and excusing her from the heaviest field work. But Sarah saw the devastation in Mary's eyes, the knowledge that she was now irrevocably tied to this place, that any child she bore would be born into the same bondage she endured. Mary had left children behind in Africa when she was captured 3 years earlier, 2 daughters she would never see again. Now she was being forced to create new life for the enrichment of her oppressor. "I pray every night that I'll miscarry," Mary confided to Sarah one night. "Is that evil, to pray that your own child won't be born?" Sarah had no answer. The moral complexities of their situation defied easy judgment. Some women did deliberately induce miscarriages, using herbs or physical methods, risking their own lives to prevent bringing children into slavery. Others accepted pregnancy as inevitable and tried to create whatever love and protection they could for their children within the system's constraints. Neither choice was wrong. Both were survival strategies in an impossible situation. February brought another crisis. Hannah, the young girl who'd been examined alongside Sarah months earlier, was discovered to be pregnant. She was 14 years old, terrified, and wouldn't name the father. Hutchins suspected one of the younger enslaved men, but Hannah's silence was absolute. Under pressure, she only repeated, "Don't remember, it was dark, don't remember." Sarah and Abeni both suspected the truth. Hannah was protecting someone, but not an enslaved man. Most likely it was one of Whitmore's sons, young Thomas Jr., who was 18 and had recently returned from studying in Williamsburg. He'd been seen watching the younger women with predatory interest, and Hannah worked in the main house several days a week, cleaning rooms and assisting with laundry. But accusing a white man, especially the master's son, of rape would only bring punishment down on Hannah herself. So she remained silent, and the plantation accepted the fiction that she'd been impregnated by one of the enslaved men. The incident galvanized something in Sarah. She began meeting secretly with a small group of women, Abeni, Rachel, Mercy, and old Bessie, from the kitchen. They gathered in the root cellar beneath the kitchen house after dark, speaking in whispers, sharing information and making plans. Not plans for immediate rebellion or escape. They weren't suicidal, but plans for resistance, for protecting each other, for maintaining their humanity in a system designed to strip it away. "We need to document what's happening here," Bessie suggested during one meeting. "Not for now, maybe not even for our lifetimes, but someday this needs to be known. The names, the violations, all of it. Someone needs to remember." Rachel, who'd learned to read by watching the Whitmore children's lessons through windows, volunteered to keep a hidden record. She stole paper scraps and a pencil stub from the main house and began recording names, dates, and events in tiny handwriting. The document was kept in a hollow space beneath the floorboards in the quarters, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. It was dangerous. Discovery would mean severe punishment, but it felt necessary. A small assertion that their lives mattered, that history shouldn't be written solely by the oppressors. As winter transitioned to early spring, Sarah's reprieve ended. Whitmore summoned her to the main house one March evening, and this time there was no fire to save her. She walked across the darkening yard with her heart in her throat, praying for strength, for endurance, for the ability to survive whatever came next without losing herself entirely. Inside, the house was warm, almost stifling after the cold of the quarters. Whitmore waited in his study, a room lined with books and maps, furnished with fine furniture shipped from England. He gestured for Sarah to sit, and she perched on the edge of a chair, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap. "Sarah, you've been here nearly a year now," he began, his tone conversational. "You've proven yourself intelligent and capable. Mrs. Whitmore has commented favorably on your work in the house. I believe you understand how things work here." Sarah kept her voice neutral. "Yes, Master. I'm a reasonable man. I don't enjoy being harsh, but I have responsibilities to my family, to this plantation, to the colony. Virginia's future depends on men like me building sustainable prosperity. That requires difficult decisions." He paused, studying her face. "I've decided it's time you were bred. There's a man, Samuel, strong worker, good temperament. I'm pairing you with him." Samuel was 40 years old, kind but broken in spirit after 20 years of enslavement. Sarah barely knew him. The idea of being forced into intimacy with a stranger, of having her reproductive choices stolen, of becoming pregnant to enrich Whitmore, it was almost too much to bear. But she forced herself to remain composed, to think strategically. "Master, may I speak freely?" Whitmore raised an eyebrow but nodded. "I'm honored by your attention to my future, but might I suggest, if breeding is the goal, wouldn't it be more effective if I felt some attachment to the man? If you allowed me to choose, perhaps the outcome would be more favorable." It was a gamble, an attempt to assert even minimal agency in a situation designed to deny her any. Whitmore considered her words, clearly intrigued by the psychology she was employing. "You make an interesting point. Very well, you may choose from among the unmarried men, with my approval, of course. But Sarah," his voice hardened, "this isn't truly a choice. One way or another you will be bred. Whether it happens with someone you prefer or someone I assign is the only variable. Understood?" "Yes, Master. Thank you for your consideration." She left the study, feeling both triumphant at gaining this small concession and devastated by the larger reality. She'd bought herself time, perhaps more bearable circumstances, but the fundamental violation remained unchanged. Back in the quarters, she discussed the situation with her trusted circle. "There's a young man, James," Mercy suggested. "He's 22, was brought over from Barbados last year. Strong, smart, kind to the children. If you must be paired with someone, he'd treat you with respect at least." Sarah had noticed James. He worked in the stables, spoke little, but carried himself with quiet dignity. The idea of being intimate with anyone under these circumstances felt wrong, coercive, tainted. But Mercy was right. If it had to happen, better someone who might treat her gently than a stranger, or worse, someone deliberately chosen to dominate or intimidate her. Over the following weeks, Sarah made opportunities to interact with James, testing his character, trying to gauge whether he was someone she could trust. He proved thoughtful and perceptive, understanding immediately the situation she faced and expressing quiet anger at the system that forced it. "I won't touch you unless you truly consent," he promised during a whispered conversation near the stables. "I don't care what the master orders. I won't be party to rape, even if it costs me." His words moved Sarah deeply. She was learning that even within the horror of slavery, human decency sometimes survived. Not always, not consistently, but enough to matter. James represented a small pocket of humanity in an inhuman situation. By April, Sarah and James had been officially paired, given a small cabin of their own, and expected to produce children quickly. The cabin was barely larger than a storage shed, but it represented a tiny increase in privacy, a space where they could speak freely without being overheard by dozens of others. They established their own boundaries. James slept on the floor initially, giving Sarah the bed, and they talked late into the nights, sharing stories of their lives before enslavement, their families, their dreams of freedom that felt impossibly distant. Slowly, painfully, something resembling affection grew between them. Not love born of freedom and choice, but a companionship forged in shared suffering. When they did eventually become intimate, it was Sarah's decision, made not from desire, but from a pragmatic understanding that pregnancy was inevitable and better it happen with someone who respected her than under more violent circumstances. "I'm sorry it's like this," James whispered afterward, holding her gently. "You deserve to be cherished, not used. You deserve everything this world has stolen from you." Sarah wept then, not from physical pain, but from the accumulated weight of violation, loss, and the cruel irony that even this small tenderness existed only because a white man had decided to breed them like livestock. The system had stolen even the possibility of authentic love, tainting everything with the knowledge that their relationship existed only at their master's pleasure and for his profit. By summer, Sarah knew she was pregnant. Morning sickness confirmed it, followed by the cessation of her monthly courses. When she informed Eleanor Whitmore, the mistress's face showed a complex mixture of satisfaction and something else, perhaps guilt, perhaps recognition of the moral compromise she'd accepted in maintaining this household. Eleanor increased Sarah's rations, excused her from the heaviest work, and added her name to the ledger of pregnant women whose bodies were enriching the Whitmore fortune. Sarah felt her body changing, felt the new life growing inside her, and experienced a confusing storm of emotions. Part of her loved this child already, wanted to protect it, imagined holding it and seeing James's eyes or her mother's smile. But another part recoiled in horror, knowing this child would be born enslaved, would never truly belong to her, would be raised to serve the people who'd violated her. The moral anguish was unbearable some days. Abeni found her crying one afternoon in the garden behind the kitchen, her hands cradling her growing belly. The old woman sat beside her, saying nothing at first, just offering silent companionship. Finally she spoke. "I've borne 8 children into this hell. 7 survived. Every one of them I loved more than my own life, and every one of them I've grieved, knowing what future they face. But I'll tell you something true, child. Love matters. Even here, even in chains, love matters. That baby you're carrying needs your love to survive, to have any chance of keeping their soul intact. Don't let them steal your capacity to love. It's the last thing we can keep for ourselves." Sarah nodded, unable to speak, drawing strength from Abeni's hard-won wisdom. She would love this child, fiercely and completely, for however long she was allowed to keep it. She would teach it secretly about freedom, about their ancestors, about the world beyond plantation boundaries. She would give it every tool she could for spiritual survival. And maybe, somehow, if God or fate or human conscience ever shifted enough, her child or her child's children might see the freedom she never would. As autumn approached and Sarah's pregnancy advanced, the plantation buzzed with activity around harvest time. The tobacco was collected, processed, and prepared for shipment to England, representing another year's profit, built on stolen labor and forced reproduction. Whitmore walked through the fields with visiting planters, proudly displaying his well-managed operation, his increasing population of enslaved workers, his system that ensured perpetual growth without additional investment. Sarah watched him from a distance, this man who'd violated her bodily autonomy, who'd forced her into reproduction, who'd stolen her future and claimed ownership of the child growing inside her. Hatred burned in her chest, pure and righteous. But alongside it, a determination grew. She would survive, she would remember, she would resist in whatever ways remained available. And when her child was born, she would teach them to survive too, to resist in their own way, to never accept that this horror was natural or inevitable or right. Sarah's daughter was born on a bitter February morning in 1644, delivered with Abini's experienced hands guiding the process, and Rachel heating water while Bessie prepared cloths and herbs. James paced outside the cabin, anxious and helpless as men always were during childbirth. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into dawn, but when Sarah finally heard her baby's first cry, the pain faded into insignificance. "A girl," Abeni announced, placing the tiny, perfect bundle in Sarah's arms. "Beautiful and strong. What will you name her?" Sarah looked down at her daughter's face, seeing James's nose and her own eyes already, and felt a love so fierce it was almost painful. "Grace," she whispered. "Her name is Grace." The name held meaning beyond its simple beauty. Grace, unearned, undeserved favor. Grace, the possibility of redemption. Grace, hope against evidence. Sarah prayed her daughter would somehow experience grace in a world determined to deny it to her. Eleanor Whitmore came to inspect the new addition to the plantation's property the next day, noting Grace's birth in the ledger, commenting on her apparent health, and reminding Sarah that she'd be expected to return to light work within 2 weeks. The baby belonged to Thomas Whitmore legally, could be sold away at any time, but conventional practice allowed mothers to keep nursing infants for at least the first year. Sarah clung to that knowledge. She had 12 months guaranteed with her daughter, 12 months to bond, to love, to imprint on this child the knowledge that she mattered, that her life had value beyond the price someone might pay for her. The first months of Grace's life were simultaneously the happiest and most terrifying period Sarah had ever experienced. Every moment with her daughter was precious. Nursing her, feeling her tiny fingers wrap around Sarah's thumb, watching her begin to smile and respond to voices. But that joy existed alongside constant fear. What if Grace got sick? What if she was sold? What if she suffered as Sarah had suffered? James proved to be a devoted father, spending every free moment with his daughter, singing to her in the evenings, crafting small toys from scraps of wood. The three of them formed a family unit that should have been idyllic, but existed instead in the shadow of ownership, their love for each other made more intense by its fragility. Other children were born that year. Mary's son, strong and healthy, Hannah's daughter, who died within a week of birth, perhaps a mercy given the circumstances of her conception. The plantation's population was growing according to Whitmore's plan, each new baby representing increased wealth, future labor, generational bondage. Sarah watched the pattern repeating with growing rage and despair. When Grace was 6 months old, Sarah returned to full work duty, taking her daughter to the fields, wrapped against her body, nursing her during brief breaks. It was exhausting, managing childcare alongside brutal physical labor. But enslaved women had been doing it for generations. They developed systems, older children watching babies, women working near each other so they could share supervision, mothers singing work songs that doubled as lullabies to soothe fussy infants strapped to their backs. The network of women that Sarah had joined continued meeting in secret, and now their discussions took on new urgency. They were watching the next generation being born into slavery, seeing the system perpetuate itself. Something had to change, but what? Rebellion had been tried on other plantations and always ended in massacre. Running away meant leaving children behind or risking their lives in escape attempts. What remained? Education. Bessie suggested during one midnight meeting, teach them everything we can, to read if possible, to count, to understand the world beyond these boundaries. Teach them they're human beings with souls and minds, not just property. Maybe if enough children grow up understanding they deserve freedom, eventually they'll find a way to claim it. It was a long-term strategy, offering no immediate relief, but perhaps it was the only realistic option. So the women began a clandestine education program, teaching children letters and numbers scratched in dirt, teaching them songs that preserved their history, teaching them to hope even when hope seemed foolish. Sarah taught Grace her first words, not just Mama and Dada, but free and home and Africa, connecting her to a heritage that slavery tried to erase. She told her stories at night about her own mother and grandmother, about their village, about a world where black people governed themselves and walked as equals with anyone. She knew Grace was too young to understand, but the words themselves felt important, seeds planted that might someday grow. As Grace approached her first birthday, new tension emerged on the plantation. Thomas Whitmore Jr., the son whom Sarah suspected of raping Hannah, was drinking heavily and becoming increasingly violent. He'd struck an enslaved man named Peter with a shovel during an argument, nearly killing him, and his father had covered up the incident to avoid scandal. But the younger Whitmore's behavior was escalating, and the enslaved population lived in heightened fear of his unpredictable rages. One evening in March of 1645, young Whitmore approached Sarah while she was washing clothes behind the kitchen house. Grace was napping in a basket nearby. He'd been drinking, his walk unsteady, his eyes unfocused, yet predatory. "Sarah, isn't it?" he slurred, moving too close. "My father's breeding project produced a healthy baby, I see. Good stock." Sarah kept washing, eyes down, trying to become invisible. But he grabbed her arm, pulling her upright, his breath hot and whiskey-sour on her face. "Maybe it's time I sampled the merchandise. See if you're as good as father claims." Terror flooded Sarah, but she forced herself to stay calm, to think strategically. "Master Thomas, your father expects me to work. If I'm delayed, he'll ask questions." "Let him ask. I'm his son. I can do what I want." As he pushed her against the wall, Sarah heard footsteps approaching, and Eleanor Whitmore's sharp voice cut through the evening air. "Thomas, your father wants you in the study. Now." The younger man released Sarah reluctantly, stumbling toward the main house and muttering curses. Eleanor looked at Sarah with an expression that was hard to read: concern, warning, complicity. She said nothing, just turned and followed her stepson, leaving Sarah shaking and sick with the knowledge that next time she might not be so lucky. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She held Grace close, breathing in her baby powder scent, and made a decision. She needed to document what was happening, not just the general facts Rachel was recording, but specific testimony, detailed accounts that couldn't be dismissed or forgotten. She began composing in her mind, memorizing phrases and details, planning to work with Rachel to get it all written down. But fate intervened before she could act. 2 days later, young Thomas Whitmore was found dead in his bed, apparently from too much drink combined with what the doctor called an apoplectic fit. His funeral was attended by the colony's elite. Speeches were made about his promise and potential, and he was buried in the family plot with full honors. The enslaved population mourned publicly as required, while privately feeling a complicated mixture of relief and continued fear. One threat was gone, but the system that enabled him remained. In the months following young Whitmore's death, the senior Thomas became more controlling, more obsessed with maintaining order and productivity. He hired a new overseer, a man named Crawford, who made Hutchins seem merciful by comparison. Crawford believed in what he called scientific management of enslaved populations, implementing new rules about work quotas, breeding requirements, and punishment for any infractions. Children over the age of 5 were put to work on light tasks, carrying water, weeding gardens, feeding chickens. Sarah watched Grace's innocence being slowly eroded as the plantation claimed her labor even in toddlerhood. The little girl was quick and bright, learning to navigate the complex social hierarchies, understanding instinctively which white people were dangerous and which might be ignored. By 1646, Sarah was pregnant again, this time deliberately. Crawford had threatened to assign James to another woman if they didn't produce a second child soon. The pregnancy was harder than the first, complicated by Sarah's emotional exhaustion and the increased labor demands. She worked through morning sickness, through physical pain, through days when despair was so heavy she could barely function. James tried to support her, but he was struggling with his own demons. He'd been whipped twice that year for minor infractions, once for allegedly working too slowly, once for supposedly looking at Eleanor Whitmore with insufficient deference. Each punishment left him more withdrawn, more broken. Sarah watched the man she'd come to love slowly having his spirit crushed under the weight of endless oppression. Their son was born in January of 1647, another difficult birth that left Sarah weak for weeks afterward. They named him Solomon, after the wise king from the Bible, hoping their son might somehow inherit that wisdom and use it to navigate the brutal world he'd entered. Solomon was quieter than Grace had been, more watchful, as if he'd absorbed his parents' trauma in the womb. The winter that followed was brutal. Food was scarce, the quarters were bitterly cold, and several children died from illness. Grace, now 3 years old, survived pneumonia that took 2 other children her age, and Sarah lived through weeks of terror that she might lose her daughter. Abeni nursed Grace through the crisis with herbs and constant care, but the experience left Sarah shaken. She was keeping these children alive only to deliver them into bondage. Was that mercy or cruelty? It's love, Abeni insisted during one of Sarah's dark moments. Whatever else it is, whatever complications exist, it's love. And love is never wrong, even in the worst circumstances. As 1647 progressed toward harvest season, news filtered through the grapevine of enslaved workers about changes in the colony. Virginia was codifying its slave laws, making the system more rigid, more explicitly racialized, more permanent. The initial ambiguity, where some Africans had managed to earn freedom through work or purchase, was closing. The category of Negro was becoming synonymous with slave, and children born to enslaved mothers would be enslaved regardless of the father's status, legally cementing the breeding program that Whitmore and planters like him had implemented informally. Sarah heard this news with soul-deep despair. The doors were closing. Whatever small hopes had existed for eventual freedom were being legally sealed shut. Her children and her children's children would be slaves, perpetually, by law, with no recourse and no escape, except what they could create through their own resistance or rebellion. The women's group met more frequently, their conversations becoming more radical. They discussed poisoning Master's food, burning down the main house, fleeing en masse, and accepting whatever consequences came. But each plan was picked apart. Too dangerous, too likely to fail, too likely to bring death down not just on the planners, but on innocent children. What resistance was possible that wouldn't result in massacre? "We survive," Abeni said finally, her voice tired but firm. "We survive and we remember. We teach our children to survive and remember. And maybe, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, someone will find a way to break this system. But that person will only exist because we survived, because we kept the knowledge of our humanity alive, even when everything tried to erase it." It wasn't the answer Sarah wanted, but it was perhaps the only honest answer available. So she continued, working, raising her children, documenting what she could, participating in small acts of resistance that wouldn't bring immediate death. She taught Grace and Solomon stories about Africa, about freedom, about their inherent worth as human beings. She sang them songs that preserved their cultural heritage. She loved them fiercely, completely, knowing that love itself was an act of resistance in a system that demanded she view them as mere property. As Grace turned 4 and began asking questions about why she couldn't play with the Whitmore children, why she had to work when white children didn't, why her mama had scars on her back, Sarah faced the painful task of explaining slavery to her daughter. How do you tell a child that the world is fundamentally unjust, that powerful people consider her property, that her body doesn't belong to her? "Listen to me carefully," Sarah said, holding Grace's small face between her hands. "Some people think they own us. They're wrong, but they have power to make us obey anyway. You're going to have to be very smart and very strong. You're going to have to work hard and seem obedient while keeping your real self hidden inside. Safe. Can you do that?" Grace nodded seriously, her dark eyes wise beyond her years. "Like a secret." "Yes, exactly like a secret. The most important secret. That you're a human being who deserves freedom, no matter what anyone says." The year 1650 arrived with no improvement in conditions and a growing sense that the slave system was becoming permanent and inescapable. Sarah was 32 years old now, worn beyond her years by hard labor, multiple pregnancies. She'd miscarried twice between Solomon and her third living child, a daughter named Ruth, and the accumulated trauma of watching her children grow up enslaved. Grace was 6, already working regularly in the fields during harvest and in the kitchen during winter. She was quick-witted and observant, characteristics that worried Sarah. Smart children asked dangerous questions and sometimes challenged authority in ways that brought punishment. Solomon was 3, quieter than his sister, but equally perceptive. Ruth had just celebrated her first birthday, a miracle child given Sarah's difficult previous pregnancies. Thomas Whitmore was 53 now, his health declining, which created its own anxieties. What would happen to the plantation when he died? Would they be sold separately, families broken apart to settle debts or satisfy inheritance arrangements? The uncertainty was agonizing. James had aged too, his spirit increasingly broken by the endless brutality. Crawford, the overseer, had targeted him specifically for the past 2 years, seeming to take pleasure in finding reasons to punish him. James bore scars across his back, burns on his arms, and a limp from when Crawford had struck his knee with a board. Sarah watched helplessly as the man she loved was methodically destroyed. One April evening, James didn't return from the fields at sunset. Sarah waited anxiously, Grace and Solomon picking up on her fear, Ruth fussing in her arms. Finally, old Josiah appeared at their cabin door, his face grave. "Sarah, you need to come. James is hurt." She left the children with a beanie and ran toward the fields where enslaved men were carrying James on a makeshift stretcher. Crawford stood to the side, examining his hands casually, and Sarah understood immediately what had happened. James was barely conscious, blood streaming from a head wound, his breathing shallow and labored. They carried him to the cabin and laid him on the bed. Sarah cleaned his wounds with shaking hands, while a Benny assessed the damage. The head injury was severe, skull possibly fractured, internal bleeding likely. Crawford had beaten him with a shovel after James supposedly talked back, though everyone knew James rarely spoke at all anymore, let alone challenged authority. "He needs a doctor," Sarah pleaded to Eleanor Whitmore when the mistress came to assess the situation. "Please, he'll die without proper treatment." Eleanor's face showed conflict. These people were valuable property, but doctors cost money, and James was just one enslaved man among many. "I'll ask my husband," she said finally, but her tone suggested little hope. Thomas Whitmore didn't summon a doctor. James lingered for 3 days, drifting in and out of consciousness while Sarah sat beside him, holding his hand, whispering prayers and promises. Grace and Solomon were brought to say goodbye, though they didn't fully understand what was happening. On the 3rd night, as rain drummed against the cabin roof, James opened his eyes one final time. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Tell our children. Tell them they're worthy of freedom. Tell them to survive. Tell them." He died without finishing the sentence, leaving Sarah clutching his still warm hand, a scream building in her chest that she couldn't release because even grief had to be controlled, measured, performed correctly, or risk punishment. She sat with his body until dawn, memorizing his face, promising him she would do as he'd asked. She would teach their children about their worth, their humanity, their right to freedom, even if that right was denied. James was buried the next day in the enslaved people's cemetery beyond the tobacco fields, a simple grave marked with a wooden cross. No investigation was conducted into Crawford's role in his death. Property damage through excessive punishment was regrettable but not criminal. Sarah returned to work 2 days later, moving through tasks mechanically, her soul numb with grief and rage. The children struggled with their father's absence. Grace became more withdrawn. Solomon cried constantly, and Ruth seemed to sense the grief saturating their home. Sarah held them together through sheer force of will, knowing that falling apart wasn't an option. She had 3 children depending on her, and their survival required her continued function. Crawford approached Sarah a month after James's death with a new proposition. "Master says you're to be bred again. Can't have valuable breeding stock sitting idle. There's a new man brought in from Barbados last week. Strong, healthy, you'll be paired with him." Sarah felt ice in her veins. The man Crawford referenced, Isaac, was massive and had a reputation for violence even among the enslaved population. The thought of being forced into intimacy with him, of having James replaced so casually, was unbearable. But what choice did she have? That night, Sarah made a desperate decision. She knew herbs that could prevent pregnancy, learned from a beanie years ago, but never used because the risks were enormous. If caught deliberately avoiding pregnancy, the punishment would be severe, whipping at minimum, possibly branding or worse. But the thought of bearing Isaac's child, of betraying James's memory in that way, was more than she could stand. She began taking the herbs secretly, carefully, while appearing to comply with Crawford's orders. Isaac visited her cabin regularly, and Sarah endured his presence with silent resignation, but the herbs worked. Months passed without pregnancy. Crawford grew suspicious, questioning Sarah, examining her roughly, threatening consequences if she didn't produce results soon. "Maybe she's just barren now," Eleanor Whitmore suggested to her husband during a conversation Sarah overheard while cleaning the study. 3 children in quick succession, then that difficult miscarriage. "Some women's bodies simply give out." "Possible," Thomas Whitmore agreed, though he sounded skeptical. "Still, she's only in her early 30s, should have another 5 to 10 years of breeding capacity. Keep trying." Sarah continued her dangerous game, knowing it couldn't last forever. Eventually, they'd realize she was deliberately preventing pregnancy, or her body would succumb to the herb's side effects: nausea, weakness, irregular bleeding that she hid as best she could. But every month without pregnancy felt like a small victory, a way of honoring James by refusing to let the system that killed him force her into creating new life. Meanwhile, Grace was growing into a startlingly bright child whose intelligence was becoming a liability. She'd somehow learned to read. Sarah suspected Bessie had been teaching her secretly and was caught with a Bible she'd taken from the main house. The punishment was 10 lashes, administered by Crawford, while Sarah was forced to watch, unable to intervene without making things worse for both of them. Grace bore the whipping stoically, refusing to cry out, and afterward looked at Sarah with eyes that held both pain and defiance. "I'm not sorry, Mama," she whispered that night as Sarah treated her wounds. "I wanted to read about Moses leading people out of slavery. I wanted to know if God really cares about people like us." Sarah's heart broke and swelled simultaneously. Her daughter was becoming a fighter, someone who questioned and resisted even at great personal cost. It was dangerous, but it was also magnificent, proof that the system hadn't broken her, that somehow Grace had maintained belief in her own humanity and worthiness. As 1651 approached, rumors spread through the enslaved community about legal changes being discussed in the Virginia House of Burgesses. The laws were becoming more explicitly racial, more permanent, eliminating any remaining ambiguities. Slavery was being codified as a hereditary, race-based perpetual system with no legal avenues for freedom. The walls were closing completely. The women's network met in the root cellar one last time before winter made such meetings too dangerous. They discussed their options with brutal honesty. There were none. Rebellion meant death. Escape meant abandoning children or risking their lives. Legal challenges were impossible when the law itself was the problem. What remained was survival and memory. "We keep our stories," Abeni said, now 70 years old and nearing the end of her life. "We remember our names, our origins, our humanity. We teach our children even though it's dangerous. We resist in small ways every day. And we wait. Maybe we'll never see freedom, but maybe our great-grandchildren will. Someone has to remember that we were people, not property, no matter what the law says." Rachel produced the hidden document she'd been maintaining, now dozens of pages recording names, dates, violations, the full scope of what had been done to them. Where should we hide this? How do we ensure it survives? They decided to bury it in a metal box near the cemetery, marking the location carefully so it might be found someday when circumstances changed. It was a desperate act, sending a message to an unknown future, hoping that eventually someone would care about their testimony. Sarah contributed her own pages to the record, details about her capture, the middle passage, her forced reproduction, James's murder, Grace's whipping. She wrote in plain, careful language, determined that if anyone ever read these accounts, they would understand the human cost of slavery's brutality. These weren't abstract historical facts. They were lived experiences of people who loved and suffered and hoped and despaired. On a cold November night, they buried the box, said prayers over it in multiple languages and traditions, and returned to their quarters knowing they'd done something meaningful even if they never saw its impact. The act itself mattered, asserting that their lives had value, that their testimony deserved preservation, that history shouldn't be written solely by those who'd oppressed them. Winter brought tragedy again. Solomon, now 4 years old, fell ill with fever and developed pneumonia. Despite everything Abeni tried, despite Sarah's constant nursing, he died 3 weeks before Christmas. Sarah buried her son next to his father, standing in freezing rain, unable to cry because crying felt insufficient for the magnitude of her loss. 2 of the people she loved most in the world, taken by a system that viewed them as expendable. Grace held Ruth's hand at the graveside, her young face set in lines too mature for a 7-year-old. When they returned to the cabin, she asked Sarah a question that had no good answer. "Mama, why does God let this happen to us?" Sarah had struggled with that question herself for years. Was this punishment, test, abandonment, or was God absent entirely, leaving humans to create and endure hell on earth without divine intervention? She didn't know, couldn't know, but she needed to give her daughter something to hold on to. "I don't know why, baby. I don't understand it. But I have to believe, that God sees us, knows our suffering, and somehow, some way, justice will come. Maybe not in our lifetime, but eventually. We have to keep faith, even when faith seems foolish." It was inadequate, but it was honest. And perhaps honesty was the best she could offer, acknowledgement that she didn't have answers, that the situation was genuinely terrible, but that surrender wasn't an option. They would survive, remember, and teach the next generation to do the same. As 1651 gave way to 1652, Sarah was 34 and felt 60. She'd lost a husband, 2 children, countless friends to disease and violence. She'd been violated, exploited, forced to reproduce for others' profit. She'd watched her daughter whipped and her son die. And yet she continued, working, mothering, resisting in small ways, maintaining her humanity against all odds. Crawford finally realized she'd been preventing pregnancy and had her whipped publicly as punishment and warning to other women. The 40 lashes left her back permanently scarred, but Sarah endured it silently, refusing to give them the satisfaction of hearing her scream. Afterward, confined to the cabin to recover, she lay on her stomach while Grace carefully cleaned her wounds, the child's small hands gentle but sure. "You're brave, Mama," Grace whispered. braver than anyone. Sarah shook her head slightly. Not brave, baby, just stubborn. Too stubborn to let them break me completely. But she was breaking, slowly, inexorably. The accumulation of trauma was taking its toll. Nightmares, sudden panic, moments where she dissociated from her body entirely, watching herself work as if from a distance. She was developing what future generations would call complex PTSD, though no such terminology existed in 1652. She only knew that survival required compartmentalizing, pushing pain into locked rooms in her mind, maintaining function even when her soul screamed for rest. The final years of Sarah's life, she would live only to 38, dying in 1656 from complications of her fourth pregnancy, were marked by a strange duality. Outwardly, she appeared resigned, compliant, broken. But inwardly, she maintained fierce resistance and absolute clarity about the injustice of her situation. She became skilled at performing the role of obedient slave, while teaching Grace and Ruth everything she knew about survival, resistance, and maintaining human dignity in dehumanizing circumstances. Thomas Whitmore died in 1653, leaving the plantation to his surviving son from his first marriage, Edward, who'd been managing operations in England. Edward Whitmore brought new ideas about slave management, influenced by practices in Caribbean sugar plantations. He was even more brutal than his father, viewing enslaved people purely as economic units, with no moral considerations. Under Edward's management, the breeding program intensified. Women were examined monthly, pregnancies were tracked obsessively, and those who didn't produce children quickly enough were punished or sold. Sarah, still recovering from Crawford's whipping and her body's breakdown from years of abuse, was nevertheless forced to become pregnant again in 1654. The pregnancy was difficult from the start, complicated by her age and physical deterioration. Grace, now 10 years old, had become Sarah's primary support. She took on adult responsibilities, caring for 8-year-old Ruth, managing household tasks, even doing some of Sarah's field work when her mother was too weak. Sarah watched her daughter's childhood being stolen and felt helpless rage, but also pride at Grace's strength and capability. "You're going to survive all this," Sarah told Grace one evening as they sat outside their cabin watching the sunset. "You're going to live to see changes, maybe even freedom. Promise me you'll survive, no matter what." Grace looked at her mother with eyes that had seen too much. "I promise, Mama, and I'll tell Ruth about you, about Papa, about Solomon. I'll make sure they're remembered." Sarah gave birth to her fourth child, a son she named James after his father, in January of 1656. The labor was catastrophic, prolonged bleeding, infection, fever that wouldn't break. Abeni, now 73 and herself fading, did everything possible, but Sarah's body had been pushed beyond its limits. She lingered for 2 weeks after the birth, drifting in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid and sometimes delirious. During her lucid moments, she talked to Grace, passing on final wisdom and instructions. "Remember who you are, not what they call you, but who you truly are. You're descended from kings and queens, from people who built civilizations. This bondage is temporary in the scope of history. Someday it will end. Maybe not in your lifetime, but someday. Keep hope alive. Teach your children. Remember everything." Grace nodded through tears, memorizing every word, every inflection of her mother's voice. Ruth, only 8, clung to her sister, not fully understanding that they were about to lose their mother permanently. Baby James nursed at Sarah's breast one final time, and she looked at him with heartbreaking love and sorrow. Another child she was bringing into bondage, another soul who would suffer for profit. On a cold February morning in 1656, Sarah died at age 38. Grace held her hand as she passed, whispering promises to remember, to survive, to resist. They buried Sarah in the enslaved people's cemetery next to James and Solomon, another wooden cross, marking a life that deserved so much more than it received. The aftermath was brutal. Grace, at 10 years old, became responsible for Ruth and baby James, while also working full days in the fields and kitchen. She'd inherited her mother's intelligence and determination, and somehow, impossibly, she managed. She kept the family together, taught Ruth everything Sarah had taught her, and raised James to know his parents' stories, even though he'd never know them personally. Grace would live to be 63, surviving into the early 1700s, witnessing the slave system becoming even more entrenched and brutal. She would bear 7 children, watch 3 die young, and see her surviving children sold away to different plantations. She would be whipped, violated, worked nearly to death, but she would survive, stubborn, resilient, never forgetting her mother's final words. The document Rachel had created, buried near the cemetery, would remain hidden for decades. In 1723, a free black man named Samuel Thompson, who worked as a gravedigger, would accidentally uncover the metal box while preparing a new burial site. He would take it to a sympathetic Quaker abolitionist who would copy the testimonies and begin sharing them through underground networks. The names and stories would be preserved, passed along, eventually becoming evidence in the moral case against slavery. But that knowledge would come too late for Sarah, for James, for Solomon, for the countless others whose lives were consumed by the system. Their suffering had been real, their resistance meaningful, their humanity absolute regardless of laws that denied it, and their testimonies, preserved through enormous personal risk, would eventually contribute to the slow, painful transformation of a nation that had built its prosperity on their stolen labor and forced reproduction. The legacy of Sarah and women like her extended far beyond their individual lives. Every person who descended from enslaved women forced to bear children for their enslavers carried that history in their DNA, their family trees, their generational trauma. The practice didn't end with Sarah. It continued for 2 more centuries, creating bloodlines marked by violence and coercion, families torn apart by sale and separation, mothers and children who never experienced the freedom to love each other without fear. When slavery finally ended in 1865, more than 200 years after Sarah's death, approximately 4 million enslaved people gained legal freedom. Many of them were direct descendants of women like Sarah, women who'd been systematically raped and forced to reproduce for profit. The psychological, social, and economic impacts of that forced breeding program would reverberate through generations, creating wounds that couldn't heal in a single lifetime or even a single century. But alongside that trauma, another legacy persisted. The legacy of resistance, of women who maintained their humanity despite everything, who loved their children fiercely and taught them to survive, who documented their stories and preserved their testimonies, who refused to accept that their oppression was natural or right or permanent. That legacy of resistance would fuel future movements for justice, inspire generations of activists and advocates, and ultimately help transform the nation that had enslaved them. Sarah's story, multiplied by millions of similar stories, each with its own details and specificities, represents one of the darkest chapters in American history. The forced breeding of enslaved women wasn't a peripheral aspect of slavery. It was central to the system's economic logic and perpetuation. Understanding this history in all its brutality isn't comfortable, but it's necessary. Only by confronting the full truth of what was done can we understand the depth of injustice that was committed and begin to address its ongoing impacts. The silenced slaves, women like Sarah whose voices were suppressed, whose testimonies were ignored, whose suffering was minimized or erased, deserve to be remembered not as passive victims, but as complex human beings who loved, hoped, resisted, and survived against impossible odds. Their stories are American history, uncomfortable as that truth may be. And their descendants living today carry forward both the trauma and the resilience of their ancestors. If this history has moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. We're committed to exploring the hidden histories of America, the stories that textbooks often gloss over or ignore entirely. These are histories that matter, that shaped our present, and that demand our attention and understanding. The story of enslaved women forced to reproduce for profit is a story about power, exploitation, resistance, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. It's a story we must never forget.